So in lesson 8.3, we're going to be talking about cell transport. So there's two types of cell transport. There is passive transport and there is active transport. Passive transport is the one that occurs naturally, the flow from high to low without energy, and active is against that concentration gradient where energy is required to move things in and out of the cell. So we're going to start with passive transport. How does passive transport work? So living cells must stay in homeostasis. So we've talked about homeostasis before, but this is a state of relatively constant internal conditions. So again, these can be physical conditions or chemical conditions in order to maintain the living conditions within the cell. So passive transport is the movement of molecules, and these molecules are going to move across a membrane, aka the cell membrane, from high to low concentration. So this is how molecules naturally want to move. When there is a higher concentration, they move and spread out until they are equally distributed. But the key here with passive transport is that we are doing this without energy. No ATP, no energy is needed to move these molecules. So the first type of passive transport we have is diffusion. And in diffusion, we are moving solute or molecules. So these solute particles that are in the air and constantly move and collide with each other. And the particles tend to move from an area where they are more concentrated, aka high concentration, to an area where they are less concentrated. So this is the natural movement from more concentration solute to less concentration solute without energy. So again, no energy is needed during the process of diffusion. And what the cell is trying to get to is a condition called equilibrium. Equilibrium is where they are equally distributed. These molecules are equally distributed on both sides of this particular cell membrane. So let's kind of take a look at a picture and kind of look at these conditions. So in number one here on the left, there is a higher concentration of solute on one side of the membrane than the other. So these blue molecules are going to be able to move across the cell membrane. So here is our cell membrane. Again, remember, this is a lipid bilayer. And again, we have a high concentration in the blue outside the cell and a low concentration in the yellow. So what we expect to see is that diffusion causes a net movement of solute particles from the side of the membrane with a higher solute concentration to the side with a lower concentration. So notice, again, we have high concentration over here, low over here. What we are going to see is a net movement of these molecules towards that low concentration. But we are still going to have some molecules moving in the opposite direction. The only difference is that we are moving more molecules from high to low. Now, once equilibrium is reached, so again, this is equilibrium, and what that means is there is an equal number on both sides of the cell membrane. Solute particles continue to diffuse across the membrane. So notice we have some molecules moving in and some molecules moving out, but they're doing so at an equal rate. So they're moving in both directions, but at approximately equal rates. So there is no net change in the solute concentration. So again, when we're looking at this, the model that shows here, this shows the process of diffusion. Because remember, diffusion is the movement of molecules across that membrane. So again, this is diffusion. because the solute molecules, can't spell there, sorry. The solute particles are moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Now remember, with passive transport, no energy is required. This is the natural movement these molecules want to do. Now, another type of passive transport is facilitated diffusion. And in facilitated diffusion, molecules that cannot diffuse through the membrane pass through a protein channel. So remember, protein channels, or proteins in general, are embedded within the cell membrane. So if you draw a simple cell membrane up here in the top, right, a phosphate head pointing out and the phospholipid tails pointing in, okay? Embedded in this membrane is we have these proteins that create a channel for a specific type of molecule to move through. So for example, let's just say we have this molecule here. Now, it can't pass through the cell membrane. So what we need is we need these channels to move the molecules from high to low, in or out of the cell. But again, we have a channel protein that's embedded in the cell membrane. So again, this process of facilitated diffusion still uses no energy, okay? But again, these are molecules that can't pass through the membrane because they are either charged ions that are not going to pass the cell membrane, as well as large molecules that are too big to just simply pass through. So remember, our lipid bilayer is a non-polar condition. So if there is a charge, they're going to repel that, or they're not going to be able to dissolve in that particular type of solution. So again, facilitated diffusion, facilitated means to help. So we have a helping protein in order to get that molecule in or out of the cell. Now, a type of facilitated diffusion is osmosis, and osmosis is only when we are moving water molecules. So water enters the cell by a facilitated diffusion process. So again, it is still something that is not using energy, but we have these proteins that allow water to pass through because it does not interact with the tails of the phospholipid bilayer. Now, many cells contain this protein that is called an aquaporin. So an aquaporin is a pore or a water pore that allow water to pass through that membrane. And when we're talking about the diffusion of water, this is referred to as osmosis. So osmosis is the diffusion of water. So again, osmosis, only water, and it is done in a facilitated diffusion process. So again, osmosis is still passive transport. So if you look how it works, again, we have these protein channels, and these protein channels only allow water to come through. Now, it's not only just about the water concentration. So we have two solutions here of sugar and water separated by a membrane that sugar can't pass through. So on this side, where we have these green molecules, so since we have more green molecules, we have a higher sugar concentration on this side of the membrane, which also means we have a lower percentage of water. So the more solute you add to a solution, the lower your concentration of water is. Now on the left side, we have low sugar because we only have one sugar molecule there, and we have a higher concentration of water. So since water naturally wants to move from a high concentration to a low concentration, we would expect the net movement of water to be from left to right. And water will move until it reaches equilibrium and both sides are balanced. So we have three types of osmotic conditions that we can experience in a cell: isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic. So isotonic is when water will move across the membrane. in both directions, meaning that the cell is not going to change shape because the concentration of solute particles inside and outside the cell are the same, or they are equal. So if I have my cell right here and I have 50% solute and 50% water, okay, and it is the same concentration outside the cell as well. So when we look at the water concentration, they're equal. So the water is going to flow in and out at an equal rate, and the cell is going to remain the same size. Now, a different condition is a hypertonic condition, and this is where water will move across the cell membrane, and it's going to move net movement out of the cell because the concentration of solute particles outside the cell are higher than inside the cell. So again, in this case, we have our cell, and as we look, we have, let's just say 70% solute outside the cell, which means we have 30% water. Now, in the cell, we still have this 50% solute and 50% water. So, since the water is higher inside the cell than outside the cell, we're going to see a net movement of the water outside the cell, which is going to cause the cell to shrink and shrivel up. This is how your cells get dehydrated when you don't have enough water outside of your cells compared to inside, and it tries to balance themselves out. So the last one we have are hypotonic, and this is where water will move across the cell membrane into the cell because the concentration of solute is higher inside than it is outside the cell. So in this case, our cell is going to get bigger. So now we have a higher concentration of solute in the cell, which means lower water. Outside the cell, we still have that 50-50 solute to water mix. So in this case, the water is going to naturally want to flow into the cell, which could potentially cause the cell to burst or lyse because the cell will get too big and it will pop. Now, this can also be shown in a controlled setting here. So the lower concentration of water molecules, okay, so we have low H2O on this side of the tube, and we have a barrier that doesn't allow the sugar to go through. But on the right-hand side, I'm sorry, I put that the wrong way. This would be a higher side of water because we have a lower concentration of sugar molecules. Now on the right side, we're going to have a lower concentration of water because we have more sugar molecules or a higher concentration of solute. So the water can only pass through this barrier, meaning that the water is going to want to try to balance and reach equilibrium, causing the water levels to drop on the left and the water levels to rise on the right. The same thing is occurring when we're talking about our cell membrane. Only the water can pass through, creating this net movement to create equilibrium. So this movement, this net movement of water into or out of the cell produces what we call osmotic pressure. So again, net movement into the cell increases pressure and out of the cell decreases pressure. So that net movement of water into or out of the cell, what it is going to do is produce a force. And that force is what we call osmotic pressure. Think of it like blowing up a balloon. The more you add to it, the more pressure is being put on the outside of those molecules. Okay? So when we're looking at this and we're seeing the effects of osmosis on a cell. So again, in isotonic, whether it's an animal or a plant cell, we have an equal amount of water going in. The concentration of solutes is the same inside and outside the cell, and the water molecules move equally in both directions, creating a net neutral molecule. Now, in a hypertonic solution, the solution has a higher solute concentration than the cell. Therefore, we're having a net movement of water molecules out, which causes the cell to shrink. Now, in a plant cell, this is also what causes the plant to wilt, as there's no longer any osmotic pressure on the cell wall. Now, in a hypotonic solution, the solution has a lower solute concentration than the cell, and a net movement of water molecules into the cell causes it to swell. And again, this could actually cause the cell to burst in an animal cell, but it also creates pressure in order to support plant cells. So plant cells will never burst because they have this very rigid cell wall that prevents the cell from bursting and getting any bigger than it needs to. So different solute concentrations inside and outside of the cell can lead to the net loss or net gain of the water molecule. Now, when we're looking at passive transports, remember, diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Osmosis is the diffusion of the water molecules through a selectively permeable membrane. So let's take a look and study the beakers at the right. The arrows between the beakers tells you what process is occurring. So when we're looking here, and the beakers to the right draw the results of the described process and draw the changes in the water level. So these are already drawn for you, but if you look here, diffusion that we look up here is the movement of these solute particles. So these solute particles are going to want to move from a high concentration to an area of low concentration, but some are still going to go back in the opposite direction. So they're going to do so until they equal on both sides, and we have an equal flow in both directions between the two. So if you look at that membrane between it, we look at the solution to the left. This is going to be a hypertonic solution. Or I shouldn't say a hypertonic solution. This is going to be our high concentration of solute molecules, and then we are going to have our low concentration of solute molecules to the right. Now, once we have the flow, they then become equal on both sides. So these molecules are going to flow in both directions until they are equal. Now, in osmosis, osmosis is the movement of water molecules, and the solute molecules can't pass. So here, the water is going to want to move to balance out. So we have a high concentration on the left and a low concentration of the solute on the right. So the water is going to want to naturally flow in this direction to balance out the number of molecules. So on the left, we are going to have a hypertonic solution. On the right, we're going to have a hypotonic solution, meaning that the water level is much higher. Now, eventually, when the water levels are equal on both sides, they then are going to become isotonic, where the cells are not going to be able to move in both directions. They are equal on both sides. So before we talked about passive transport, now we're looking at active. And in active transport, we are focusing on movement of molecules that require energy. So energy is needed to move these molecules against their concentration gradient. So how does active transport work? So active transport is the movement of materials against their concentration gradient. So again, here's the key, is against the gradient. So since we're against the concentration gradient, energy is required in order to do so. So when we mean against the gradient, we're moving molecules from low concentration to high concentration. And again, this requires energy in order to get this task done. Now, we have three main types of active transport. And the first one we have here is a protein pump. So with the protein pump, you can see how ATP, the energy molecule there, is needed to change the shape of the protein. So the energy of ATP is used to pump small molecules and ions across the cell membrane. So again, energy is needed. So that energy from that ATP molecule is used to pump small molecules and ions across the cell membrane. So the protein changes shape during this process, binding substances to one side of the membrane and releasing them on the other. Now, the next one we have here, I'm just going to draw a line here to separate. And this middle one here is called endocytosis. So endocytosis is how molecule or large molecules are going to leave the cell. So the membrane, the cell membrane, forms a pocket around the large molecule. So again, it's this is the way that large things can enter into the cell. So again, around that particle to form a vesicle. And remember, a vesicle is a vehicle that moves molecules. And again, this vesicle is to move this large molecule into the cell. Now, again, this still requires ATP or energy in order to move this molecule into the cell. Now, with moving stuff into the cell like food and water, we also need to expel things like proteins or waste. So this is exocytosis. So in exocytosis, that membrane of a vesicle surrounds the material. Then it fuses with the cell membrane to force it out. So again, exo, exit, endo, enter. But again, all of these require ATP, which equals energy. So every single one of these requires energy to move them in or out of the cell. So many cells use these protein pumps. And cellular energy to move ions such as calcium, potassium, sodium across the membrane. And why they are doing this is to build up concentrations of it. And when you're building up a concentration of the substance, it allows the body to do certain chemical reactions that is needed within life. So besides molecular transport, cells also need to have a bulk transport. So this is where that endocytosis and exocytosis come into play. Again, they are still using energy to move these molecules. So in bulk transport, large molecules or even clumps of materials can be moved across the cell membrane by bulk transport. Again, energy is required. The two types of bulk transports that we have are endocytosis, which is the process of bringing material into the cell. So again, we're talking about large things like food, water, nutrients. So again, we're bringing these material into a cell. And again, energy is required. And the way that this does it is it does it by means of this part of the cell membrane. So the membrane, what it will do will actually begin folding around the material. So it begins to fold in or it begins to form a pocket. And again, that cell membrane will surround that material till eventually it is incorporated into the cell. Now, exocytosis is when we have to get rid of things like waste, things like proteins that we're exporting. But again, in exocytosis, the cells can release materials. And these materials are then kind of the same way, except in reverse. The membrane folds around that material, and then eventually it's pushed into the cell membrane and released to the exterior world. Again, this process is really, really important in getting rid of waste. So endocytosis is bringing the materials in, entering. I always like to think of the abbreviations N stands for enter, and exo stands for exit. Now, if we take a look at this picture, what type of cell transport is modeled here? So we're looking at a protein moving these molecules in from a low concentration to a high concentration. And again, energy is required. So anytime you see molecules moving against their gradient and energy being required, this should tell you that it is active transport. Now, the reason that it's active transport is because energy is required for the solute particles to cross the cell membrane. So if we review this material and we take a look at this T chart here, remember we have two types of transport that we're looking at, passive and active. So let's kind of compare these two things, and we're going to start with passive transport. So remember, passive transport does not use cellular energy. So again, we're not using energy to move these molecules. And again, with passive transport, we're moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So with this high to low concentration, we don't have any energy because that's how molecules naturally want to move. So a couple examples of those molecules moving, we have diffusion, we have osmosis, and we have facilitated diffusion. So we're looking at diffusion is the movement of molecules. Osmosis is the movement of water, which is kind of like still, even though it's osmosis, is still facilitated diffusion because of those aquaporins. And then facilitated diffusion, a protein is used to help move the molecules in or out of the cell. Now, active transport is a little bit different because active transport requires energy. Okay. Now, in this case, the particles are moving from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So again, this is against the natural gradient. And what this means is that it requires energy to do so. So this includes exocytosis, which is the movement of molecules out of the cell, and endocytosis, which is the movement of molecules into the cell. So exo, exit, or out, endo, enter, or in. So hopefully this helps you out with lesson 8.3. Again, looking at cell transport. Again, hopefully this helps out. This is Mr. O'Brien.